13-year-old Thomas Blackwell stood in the cotton fields of rural Alabama, dirt caked under his fingernails, sweat dripping down his face. But this wasn't from picking cotton. He had just finished burying his entire family alive. His mother, father, 2 sisters, and baby brother, all still breathing when the last shovel of earth hit their makeshift grave. The year was 1886, and what happened next would haunt the small town of Millbrook for generations. Because 3 days later, scratching sounds started coming from beneath the ground. And Thomas? He just smiled. The Blackwell family seemed ordinary enough. Samuel Blackwell worked the cotton fields like every other man in Millbrook. His wife Mary tended to their 4 children in their small wooden cabin. They attended church every Sunday, paid their debts, and kept to themselves. But behind closed doors, something twisted was growing in young Thomas. It started with small animals. The neighbor's cat went missing in early spring. Then chickens from 3 different farms disappeared within a week. Old Mrs. Henderson swore she saw Thomas near her chicken coop the night before her prize rooster vanished. But when confronted, the boy just stared with those pale blue eyes and said nothing. Samuel dismissed the rumors. Boys will be boys, he told anyone who would listen. Thomas was just going through a phase. Every child acts out sometimes. But Mary noticed things her husband chose to ignore. The way Thomas watched his baby brother sleep, his head tilted like a curious dog. How he volunteered to help with chores that kept him alone with his sisters. The strange drawings she found hidden under his mattress. Stick figures in boxes, underground. The first sign of real trouble came on a humid June evening. Thomas's sister Emma, only 8 years old, came running into the house screaming. Her arm was bent at an impossible angle, bone showing through torn flesh. She claimed she had fallen from the old oak tree, but Mary noticed something odd. The tree was perfectly healthy, no broken branches, no disturbed bark. And Emma kept looking at Thomas with pure terror in her eyes. When Mary asked what really happened, Emma whispered 6 words that chilled her to the bone. "Tommy pushed me. He wanted to." Samuel refused to believe it. "Accidents happen on farms," he insisted. "Children fall from trees all the time." But Mary started watching Thomas more carefully. She noticed how he moved through the house like a shadow, always appearing where you least expected him. How conversation stopped when he entered a room. How the family dog, Rex, had started hiding whenever Thomas was around. 3 weeks after Emma's accident, something far worse occurred. Thomas's other sister, 6-year-old Catherine, went missing during the night. The family searched everywhere, the barn, the fields, the nearby woods. Samuel organized half the town to look for her. They found her 18 hours later, trapped in an old well on the abandoned Henderson property. Catherine was alive, but barely conscious and babbling about Tommy's game. She claimed her brother had led her there in the darkness, telling her they were playing hide and seek. When she climbed down into the well to hide, he had covered the opening with wooden boards and walked away. If Mrs. Henderson hadn't heard her weak cries while collecting wild berries, Catherine would have died down there. This time, even Samuel couldn't deny what was happening. But instead of getting help, he made a decision that would doom his entire family. He decided to handle Thomas himself. No doctors, no authorities, no outside interference. Just good old-fashioned discipline and prayer. That was his first mistake. Samuel locked Thomas in the root cellar for 3 days as punishment. No food, no water, no light. Just Thomas alone in the darkness with his thoughts. When they finally let him out, something fundamental had changed in the boy. The nervous energy was gone, replaced by an unnatural calm. He apologized for what happened to Catherine. He promised to be good. He even helped with extra chores around the farm. Mary wanted to believe the punishment had worked, but deep down, she knew better. Thomas wasn't sorry. He was planning. The end came on a sweltering night in August. Samuel had been drinking, which made him sleep heavier than usual. Mary had taken laudanum for one of her headaches. The children were exhausted from a long day of work. The perfect conditions for what Thomas had been preparing for weeks. He started with baby William, barely 2 years old. The child didn't even wake up as Thomas carried him outside. Emma and Catherine came next, both too drowsy to resist their older brother. Mary stirred as he dragged her from bed, but the laudanum kept her movements slow and confused. Samuel was the hardest, but Thomas had prepared for this too. A heavy cast-iron skillet to the back of the head ensured his father wouldn't interfere. In the pale moonlight, Thomas led his semi-conscious family to a spot he had chosen carefully, behind the old tobacco barn, where the soil was soft and no one would think to look. He had spent weeks digging the pit during the day while everyone else worked, telling anyone who asked that Samuel had ordered him to dig a new root cellar. The hole was 8 feet deep, 10 feet wide, and 12 feet long. Plenty of room for 5 people. Thomas had even thoughtfully provided wooden crates as makeshift coffins, with small holes drilled in the sides. Not enough air to live long, but enough to stay conscious for a while. One by one, he lowered his family into the ground. Baby William went in first, still sleeping peacefully in his tiny crate. The girls came next, now awake enough to realize something terrible was happening. They begged Thomas to stop, to let them out, to explain what they had done wrong. He didn't answer, just kept working methodically, like he was planting crops. Mary went in fourth, finally alert enough to understand what her eldest son was doing. She didn't beg or plead. Instead, she looked up at Thomas and asked one simple question: why? His answer was the most chilling part of the entire night. Because I wanted to see what would happen. Samuel was the last to go in, blood still trickling from his head wound. He was conscious enough to curse his son, to threaten what he would do when he got out. But Thomas just smiled and started shoveling dirt. The really disturbing part wasn't the murders themselves. It was how Thomas went about it. He worked slowly, almost lovingly, stopping frequently to listen to the sounds coming from below. When baby William started crying, Thomas would pause and tilt his head, like he was enjoying a piece of music. When his sisters started screaming, he actually hummed along. It took him nearly 4 hours to fill the grave completely. By the time he finished, the sounds from below had mostly stopped, but not entirely. As Thomas patted down the last shovel of earth, he could still hear faint scratching, fingernails against wood. His family was still alive down there, still trying to claw their way out. And Thomas found this absolutely fascinating. He cleaned up methodically, returning the shovels to the barn and washing the dirt from his hands at the well. Then he went back to the house and climbed into his bed like nothing had happened. When neighbors came by the next morning, wondering where the Blackwell family had gone, Thomas had a perfectly reasonable explanation ready. His family had packed up during the night and moved to Birmingham, he told them. Samuel had gotten a job offer at a steel mill and decided to take it immediately. They had been in such a hurry, they couldn't wait to say goodbye to anyone. Thomas was staying behind temporarily to sell the farm and their livestock. It was a believable story. People moved away from small towns all the time, chasing better opportunities in the growing cities. And Thomas played his part perfectly. He seemed sad to be left behind, but understanding of his family's need to start fresh. Several neighbors even offered to help him with the farm work until he could join his family in Birmingham. For 3 days, life in Millbrook went on as normal. Thomas tended to the animals, cooked simple meals for himself, and answered questions from concerned neighbors. He even attended church on Sunday, sitting alone in the Blackwell family pew with his head bowed respectfully during prayers. But on Monday night, everything changed. Mrs. Peterson, who lived in the closest farmhouse, woke up to strange sounds coming from the direction of the Blackwell property. At first she thought it might be coyotes or wild dogs digging around the farm. But as she listened more carefully, the sounds seemed almost human, like scratching, like someone trying to dig their way out of something. She mentioned it to her husband at breakfast, but he dismissed her concerns. Probably just animals getting into the grain storage, he said. Thomas was just a boy. He couldn't be expected to maintain the farm as well as a grown man. But the sounds continued the next night, and the night after that. Other neighbors started noticing them too. Always around midnight, always coming from behind the tobacco barn. Scratching, scraping, like fingernails on wood. Sometimes they swore they could hear voices, too faint to make out words, but definitely human. On Thursday night, brave souls finally decided to investigate. What they found behind the tobacco barn changed everything. The ground in a large rectangular area was disturbed, not quite level with the surrounding soil, and the scratching sounds were definitely coming from underneath. Thomas was still maintaining his story about his family moving to Birmingham, but people were starting to ask uncomfortable questions. If the family had left so suddenly, why hadn't they taken their personal belongings? Why were all of Mary's dresses still hanging in the wardrobe? Why was baby William's favorite toy still sitting on the kitchen table? And most importantly, why did Thomas seem so calm about being abandoned by his entire family? The breaking point came when Sheriff Morrison decided to send a telegram to Birmingham, checking on the Blackwell family's supposed new address. The response came back quickly. No family by that name had arrived in the city. No Samuel Blackwell was working at any of the steel mills. The family Thomas claimed had left him behind simply didn't exist. Sheriff Morrison arrived at the Blackwell farm on Friday evening with 3 deputies and several townsmen. They found Thomas sitting on the front porch, whittling a piece of wood with a knife. When asked where his family really was, he just smiled and pointed toward the tobacco barn. "They're playing a game," he said calmly. "Hide and seek. They're very good at hiding. What the men uncovered behind the barn would haunt Millbrook for generations. 5 wooden crates buried 8 feet underground, each containing a member of the Blackwell family. All had been dead for days, but the condition of the crates told a horrifying story. Deep scratches covered the inside walls where desperate fingernails had clawed at the wood. The air holes Thomas had drilled were too small, allowing just enough oxygen to prolong the agony but not enough to sustain life. The most disturbing discovery was in Samuel's crate. He had managed to break through one of the wooden walls before suffocating, only to find himself pressed against packed earth with nowhere to go. His fingernails were torn to bloody stumps where he had tried to dig through solid soil. As the men worked to recover the bodies, Thomas sat nearby watching with fascination. He showed no remorse, no fear, no emotion at all except curiosity. When Sheriff Morrison asked why he had done such a terrible thing, Thomas gave the same answer he had given his mother: "Because I wanted to see what would happen." The trial that followed was unlike anything Alabama had seen before. Thomas Blackwell, at 13 years old, became the youngest person in state history to be charged with multiple murders. The case drew reporters from as far away as Atlanta and New Orleans, all fascinated by the quiet boy who had systematically destroyed his own family. During the proceedings, disturbing details emerged about Thomas's behavior in the months leading up to the murders. Neighbors testified about missing animals and strange incidents involving the Blackwell children. A local doctor examined Thomas and declared him legally sane, but suggested something was fundamentally wrong with his mind, something that couldn't be fixed with medicine or prayer. The most chilling testimony came from Catherine, Thomas's 6-year-old sister, who had somehow survived long enough to scratch a message into her wooden prison. Using a small nail she had found in the crate, she had carved words into the wood. "Tommy is watching us die." Even more disturbing, investigators found a journal hidden in Thomas's room. Page after page of detailed observations about death and dying. He had documented the sounds animals made as they suffocated. He had measured how long different creatures survived in buried containers. He had sketched diagrams showing the most efficient ways to construct underground prisons. The journal revealed that Thomas had been planning his family's murder for over a year. He had tested his methods on dozens of small animals, refining his technique like a scientist conducting experiments. The entry dated the day before the murders was particularly chilling. "Tomorrow I will discover if humans make different sounds than rabbits when they know they cannot escape." During his own testimony, Thomas showed no emotion or remorse. He answered questions with the detached curiosity of someone discussing the weather. When asked if he understood what he had done was wrong, he replied, "Wrong for who? I learned what I wanted to learn." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding Thomas guilty on all counts. But his age presented a legal problem. Alabama had never executed someone so young. and many people were uncomfortable with the precedent it would set. After much debate, the judge sentenced Thomas to life in prison at the state penitentiary. But Thomas Blackwell never made it to prison. On the night before his scheduled transfer, he simply vanished from the Millbrook jail. The cell was still locked from the outside, the bars showed no signs of tampering, and the single window was too small for even a child to crawl through. Yet somehow, Thomas was gone. Sheriff Morrison found only one clue. Scratched into the stone wall of the cell were the words, "I'm going to keep playing the game." Some say Thomas died trying to escape through the jail's ancient sewage system. Others believe he was helped by family members who couldn't bear to see such a young boy imprisoned for life. But the people of Millbrook knew better. They had seen what Thomas was capable of, how he could move through the world like a shadow, always appearing where least expected. In the years that followed, strange incidents plagued the area around the old Blackwell farm. Travelers reported hearing scratching sounds coming from underground, always around midnight, always near the tobacco barn. Several people claimed to see a pale boy watching them from the tree line, never speaking, just observing with curious eyes. The Blackwell property stood empty for decades. No one wanted to buy land where such horrific crimes had occurred. The house slowly fell into disrepair, windows broken by stones and weather, roof sagging under the weight of neglect. But local children dared each other to sneak onto the property, especially near the spot where the family had been buried. Many of those children reported the same experience, the feeling of being watched by invisible eyes, followed by the sound of scratching from beneath their feet. Some claimed they could hear faint voices calling for help, though the words were never quite clear enough to understand. In 1923, nearly 40 years after the murders, construction workers building a new railroad line discovered something disturbing about a mile from the old Blackwell farm. Buried in a shallow grave were the remains of a young man, roughly in his 20s based on bone analysis. He had been placed in a wooden crate similar to those Thomas had used for his family, complete with small air holes drilled in the sides. More disturbing were the scratches covering the inside of this makeshift coffin, and the fact that forensic examination suggested the victim had survived for several days after burial. Local authorities suspected this might be connected to the Blackwell case, but with no surviving witnesses and no way to identify the victim, the case remained unsolved. Similar discoveries continued for years. Always bodies found in wooden crates, always buried just deep enough to muffle screams, but shallow enough for the killer to hear the desperate scratching of fingernails against wood. The victims varied: traveling salesmen, drifters, occasionally local people who had ventured too close to the abandoned Blackwell property. By the 1940s, most people assumed Thomas Blackwell was long dead. But the killings continued, always following the same pattern, always featuring that signature element of buried victims left with just enough air to prolong their suffering. Whoever was responsible had turned Thomas's childhood experiment into a lifelong obsession. The last confirmed victim was discovered in 1963, nearly 80 years after Thomas had buried his family. A young couple traveling through Alabama had stopped to camp near what they thought was an empty field. Their car was found abandoned, personal belongings scattered as if they had been taken by surprise. Local searchers found their bodies 3 days later, buried in adjoining wooden crates behind a grove of oak trees. Like all the previous victims, they had survived long enough to scratch desperate messages into the wood. But this time, investigators found something new carved into the female victim's makeshift coffin. He's still just a boy. Whether that referred to Thomas Blackwell himself, impossibly surviving into his 90s, or perhaps a successor carrying on his twisted work, no one could say. But the people of Millbrook, those few families who could trace their roots back to 1886, understood the truth. Evil like Thomas Blackwell's doesn't simply die. It adapts, it evolves. It finds new ways to satisfy its hunger for human suffering. The boy who had wanted to see what would happen when he buried his family alive had discovered something far more valuable than the answers to his original questions. He had learned that the game never has to end. The old Blackwell property was finally developed in 1987, turned into a small residential neighborhood called Millbrook Meadows. The developers were careful not to mention the land's history in their marketing materials. Young families moved in, attracted by the affordable homes and quiet rural setting. But on certain nights, when the wind is just right and the moon is dark, residents of Millbrook Meadows report hearing familiar sounds drifting up from beneath their foundations. Scratching, scraping, like fingernails desperately clawing at wood. And sometimes, just sometimes, they swear they can see a pale figure watching from the tree line. A boy who never aged, never changed, never stopped playing his favorite game. The question isn't whether Thomas Blackwell is still out there. The question is, what has he learned about human nature in all these years of practice?